The road to Ashen Hollow was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and every shadow felt like it was watching me. I hadn't planned to take this route, but my GPS had insisted it was the fastest way to my destination. The first sign that something was wrong was the fog. It rolled in suddenly, thick and unnatural, swallowing the road ahead. I slowed the car to a crawl, gripping the wheel tightly as visibility dropped to almost nothing. Then I saw it. A wooden sign barely visible in the fog, its letters faded and weathered. Welcome to Ashen Hollow. I had never heard of the place before. The village seemed to emerge from the fog as though it had been waiting for me. The houses were old, their wooden frames leaning precariously, and the streets were eerily quiet. There were no cars, no streetlights, and no signs of life. I pulled over and checked my phone, but there was no signal. The GPS had frozen on a blank screen. I looked at the fuel gauge and felt a pang of unease. I didn't have enough gas to turn back, not without finding help first. Reluctantly, I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the gravel. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. I decided to explore, hoping to find someone who could point me to a gas station or at least tell me where I was. The village was small, with narrow cobblestone streets that twisted and turned like a maze. The houses were close together, their windows dark and lifeless. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Finally, I came across a small building that looked like a general store. The sign above the door was cracked and barely legible, but the lights inside were on. Relief flooded through me as I stepped inside. The store was cluttered and dimly lit, its shelves lined with items that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A man stood behind the counter, his face pale and expressionless. He watched me silently as I approached. "Hi," I said, trying to sound calm. "I think I got lost. Do you know where I can find some gas?" The man didn't respond at first. He just stared at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. "Gas," I repeated. "Or maybe a phone. Mine's not working." Still, he said nothing. "Look, I don't mean to bother you," I said, my unease growing. "I just need to get out of here." Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and monotone. "You shouldn't have come." "What?" I asked, taken aback. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Leave before it's too late." The lights flickered, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "I would leave if I could," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I don't have enough gas." The man tilted his head slightly as if considering my words. Then he pointed to a small canister on one of the shelves. "Take it," he said, "but leave, now." I hesitated, unsure if I could trust him. But I didn't have much of a choice. I grabbed the canister and placed a few bills on the counter, though he didn't seem to notice. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. "Stay on the main road," he said. "And whatever you do, don't look back." The warning stayed with me as I filled my tank and prepared to leave the village. The fog had lifted slightly, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive. I started the car and pulled onto the main road, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The village faded into the distance, and I felt a small wave of relief. But then the headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A figure stood in the middle of the road, its face obscured by the fog. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't move, didn't chase me. It just stood there, watching. And then the engine died. Panic set in as I tried to restart the car, but the engine refused to turn over. The figure in the rearview mirror was closer now, its form becoming clearer. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an odd angle. I locked the doors, my heart pounding. The figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate. I reached for my phone, but the screen was still blank. The figure stopped a few feet from the car, its face still obscured. Then it raised one hand and pointed toward the village. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its arm outstretched, waiting. I didn't have a choice. I stepped out of the car, the cold air stinging my skin. The figure didn't react as I walked past it, back toward the village. As I approached the darkened streets, I felt the weight of the silence settle over me again. The houses seemed closer now, their windows like empty eyes watching my every move. I reached the general store, but the lights were off, and the door was locked. The man was gone. The fog began to roll in again, thicker this time, swallowing the village in a suffocating grey haze. I turned back toward the road, but the figure was there, blocking my path. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice low and guttural. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "They're waiting for you." The ground beneath me trembled, and the fog seemed to thicken, pressing against me like a living thing. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the streets. I turned and ran, my instincts screaming at me to get away. But no matter how far I ran, the village seemed to stretch endlessly before me, its narrow streets twisting and turning like a labyrinth. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right behind me. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I reached the center of the village, where a large, decrepit building loomed in the fog. The door was slightly ajar, and faint lights spilled out onto the cobblestones. I hesitated, but the footsteps were almost upon me. With no other choice, I stepped inside. The interior of the building was dark and cold, the air heavy with the scent of decay. The faint light came from a single candle, flickering on a table in the center of the room. The door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around, my heart racing. The figure was gone, but I wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, their forms just out of reach of the candlelight. I could hear them breathing, low and ragged, as they circled me. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. One of the shadows stepped into the light, revealing a face I recognized. It was me. The flickering candle on the table was the only source of light in the room, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the walls. I stared at the figure in front of me, my breath catching in my throat. It was me, or at least something wearing my face. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to pull the air from the room. Its mouth twisted into a smile that didn't belong to me, the kind of grin that spoke of malice and mockery. What are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. It tilted its head, mimicking the way I had done when I first saw the figure in the fog. "I am you," it said, though the voice was deeper, distorted, like two people speaking at once. "No, you're not," I said, stepping back. My legs hit the edge of the table and I nearly toppled over. "Oh, but I am," it said, taking a step closer. I'm everything you fear, everything you hide, everything you'll never admit to yourself. I shook my head, my heart pounding. This isn't real. You're not real. The thing laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Is that what you tell yourself? That none of this is real? Then why are you here? Why did you come to Ashen Hollow? I didn't mean to, I said, my voice barely audible. I just got lost. It leaned closer, its face inches from mine. No one comes to Ashen Hollow by accident. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the cold stone floor as I bolted for the door. The candle flickered violently, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch toward me, their jagged forms reaching for my limbs. The door slammed open with a deafening crash, and I stumbled out into the street, gasping for air. The fog had thickened, wrapping around the village like a living thing. I could barely see a few feet ahead, but I kept running, my instincts screaming at me to get away. The streets twisted and turned, the houses looming like silent sentinels in the mist. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't find my way out. Every corner I turned brought me back to the same square, the same candlelit building standing at its center. I collapsed to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fog pressed closer, suffocating, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the streets. A figure emerged from the mist, its form tall and skeletal. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. "You shouldn't have left," it said, its voice low and guttural. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "To show you the truth," it said simply. The fog around us shifted, swirling like smoke caught in a breeze. The buildings of Ashen Hollow began to fade, replaced by a scene that made my blood run cold. I was standing in a forest, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches bare and blackened. The ground was covered in snow, but it wasn't clean and white like before. It was stained red, dark patches spreading out like veins. And in the distance, I saw them. Figures stood among the trees, their bodies wrapped in tattered cloaks. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow voids. They turned toward me in unison, their movements stiff and unnatural. "They are the lost," the hooded figure said. "The ones who tried to leave Ashen Hollow without paying the price." "What price?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The price of knowing," it said. The scene shifted again, the forest dissolving into smoke. I was back in the square, but now the village was alive. People bustled through the streets, their faces flushed with cold and laughter. Bells rang from the steeple of a church, and garlands of holly and pine adorned the windows of every house. It was Christmas, vibrant and full of life. But something was wrong. The laughter didn't match the expressions on the villagers' faces. Their smiles were strained, their eyes darting nervously toward the edges of the square. The bells rang, but their tone was hollow, discordant. And then I saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the square, her face pale and gaunt. Her dark hair hung limply over her shoulders, and her hollow eyes stared at me. "She's here," someone whispered. The villagers froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Slowly, they turned toward the woman, their faces twisting in fear. "You broke the rules," one of them said, his voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She simply raised her hand, and the bells fell silent. The vision ended as suddenly as it began, and I was back in the present, the fog wrapping around me like a vice. The hooded figure loomed over me, its presence suffocating. "What does it mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It means you have a choice," it said. "What choice?" "To stay or to leave," it said. "To pay the price or to become one of the lost." I stared at the figure, my mind racing. "What is the price?" It didn't answer. Instead, it stepped back into the fog, disappearing as if it had never been there. I stumbled back toward the car, desperate to leave. The fog seemed to part as I moved, revealing the road ahead. The village was silent now, its streets empty and lifeless. When I reached the car, the engine started without issue, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I could escape. Maybe I could outrun whatever Ashen Hollow wanted from me. But as I drove, the fog closed in again, thicker than before. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through the forest without end. And then the bells began to ring. The bells' chime echoed through the dense fog, an unnatural sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air around me. It wasn't just a noise anymore, it was a presence, one I couldn't escape. I sat frozen in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The engine had died, the headlights dimming to nothing. The world beyond the windshield was swallowed by the oppressive mist, and the only thing cutting through the silence was the rhythmic toll of the bells. I had to move. Staying here felt like waiting for something to come, something I didn't want to see. Grabbing the flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out into the freezing air. The fog wrapped around me, thick and suffocating, muffling the sound of my footsteps on the gravel road. My breath clouded in front of me as I turned, shining the flashlight down the path ahead. There was no sign of the village, no sign of the figure that had pointed me back here. It was just the empty road and the endless stretch of trees, their bare branches twisting like skeletal fingers toward the sky. But then I saw it. At first, it was faint, barely visible through the swirling mist. A flicker of light far down the road. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was the only sign of anything in this desolate stretch of wilderness. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay put. But the bells were growing louder, their toll pulling at me like a thread unraveling a seam. I didn't have a choice. The flashlight flickered as I walked, its weak beam cutting through the fog. The light ahead grew brighter with each step, resolving into a faint orange glow. A fire. It wasn't coming from the road. The flames flickered from a clearing just beyond the tree line, their light casting eerie shadows that danced among the trunks. I stepped off the road, my boots crunching through the snow as I moved toward the fire. The bells were deafening now, their chime rattling through my skull. And then I stepped into the clearing. The fire burned in the center of the clearing, its flames impossibly tall and vivid, as though the wood feeding it was soaked in oil. But the fire wasn't the strangest thing. Figures stood around it, their faces hidden by dark hoods. Their bodies were unnaturally still, their heads bowed toward the flames. For a moment, I thought they hadn't noticed me. But as I stepped closer, their heads turned in unison, their movements slow and mechanical. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Beneath the hoods, their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow voids that seemed to absorb the light. "You shouldn't have come here," one of them said, their voice low and distorted. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "I didn't mean to," I stammered. I just got lost." The figures didn't move. They simply stared at me, their hollow eyes unblinking. "No one comes to Ashen Hollow by accident," another said. The fire flickered violently, its flames rising even higher, and the air around me grew heavy with heat and smoke. The figures began to move, their heads tilting unnaturally as they circled me. "You are marked now," one of them said.
"Marked for what?" I demanded, my voice trembling.
"For balance," the figure replied. The word sent a chill through me, and I thought of the hooded man's warning. No one leaves without paying the price. "I don't want anything to do with this," I said, taking another step back. The figures stopped moving, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You already do," one of them said. "The bells have chosen you."
The fire surged again, and the clearing was suddenly alive with movement. Shadows spilled from the flames, twisting and writhing like living things. They wrapped around the trees, the ground, and the figures, their presence cold and suffocating.
The bells grew louder, their sound vibrating through my bones. I turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as I sprinted back toward the road. The shadows followed, their tendrils reaching for me, brushing against my skin like icy fingers. I didn't stop until I reached the car, throwing myself into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life as I turned the key, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires skidding on the icy road as I sped away from the clearing. The road stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and turning through the fog. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, the sound of the bells still ringing in my ears. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The figures were standing in the middle of the road, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Behind them the fire burned, its flames stretching impossibly high into the night sky. I pressed down harder on the gas, my heart racing. The car skidded around a curve, the tires barely holding their grip on the icy pavement. When I looked back again, the figures were gone. But the bells hadn't stopped. The road seemed endless, the same stretch of trees and fog repeating over and over. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the sound of the bells, their chime growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. And then the engine sputtered. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Not again."
The car jerked violently and the engine died, leaving me in silence. The bells were deafening now, a constant rhythmic toll that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I stepped out of the car, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The fog was thicker than ever, wrapping around me like a living thing.
Ahead, a faint glow pierced the mist, the fire still burning in the distance. I knew I shouldn't go back. Every instinct told me to stay away, but the bells were pulling at me, dragging me toward the light. I began to walk, my steps slow and hesitant. The fog seemed to close in around me, and the glow of the fire grew brighter with every step. When I reached the clearing, the fire was gone. In its place was a massive tree, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky. Bells hung from every branch, their surfaces tarnished and rusted, their chime resonating through the air. The figures were there too, standing in a circle around the tree. They turned toward me as I entered the clearing, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "The price must be paid," one of them said.
"What price?" I demanded, my voice trembling.
"The price for knowing," another replied. The ground beneath me trembled, and the bells began to chime faster, their sound rising to a deafening crescendo. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the noise consumed me. The shadows spilled from the tree, wrapping around me, pulling me toward the figures.
"You shouldn't have come here," the first figure said.
And then everything went dark. The darkness was overwhelming, pressing against me like a living thing. For a moment, I felt like I was floating, untethered from time and space, the chime of the bells echoing in the void. Then slowly the world began to take shape again. I was back in Ashen Hollow, but it was different now. The fog had lifted, revealing a village that was no longer deserted. People filled the streets, their faces turned toward the church steeple, as if in prayer. The sound of the bells was deafening now, their toll reverberating through the air. But something was wrong. The villagers weren't moving. They stood frozen, their heads bowed, their hands clasped tightly in front of them. Their eyes were open, staring blankly ahead, unseeing. I called out to them, but my voice was swallowed by the bells. The air grew colder as I moved through the square, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. The church doors were open, and light spilled out onto the street, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. I hesitated at the threshold, the bells louder than ever, vibrating through my skull. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but something pulled me forward, an invisible thread drawing me into the church. The interior was bathed in an eerie golden light. The pews were filled with villagers, their faces pale and expressionless, their heads turned toward the altar. And there, at the center of the altar, stood the source of the light. It was a bell. Larger than any I had seen before, its surface gleamed with an unnatural brightness, and its chime filled the air with a sound that was both beautiful and terrible. As I stepped closer, the air grew heavier, making it harder to breathe. My body felt sluggish, as though the bell's toll was pulling at my very soul. "You came back," a voice said, sharp and cold. I turned to see her, the woman from the forest. She stood at the far end of the church, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "I didn't have a choice," I said, my voice trembling. "There is always a choice," she said, stepping closer. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she were testing the limits of the space around her. "What is this?" I asked, gesturing toward the bell. "This," she said, her voice softening, "is the heart of Ashen Hollow, the first bell, the beginning of it all." I stared at it, the light from its surface reflecting in her empty eyes. "What does it want?" She tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. "It doesn't want. It demands." The villagers in the pews began to stir, their movements slow and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. Their heads turned toward me, their blank eyes locking onto mine. "The bells require balance," the woman said. "For every gift, there is a price. For every protection, a sacrifice." "I didn't ask for protection," I said. "No," she said, her smile sharp and cruel. "But you rang the bell, and now the price must be paid." I backed away, my heart pounding. The villagers rose from their seats, their movements jerky and mechanical, their eyes still fixed on me. "What happens if I don't pay?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The woman's smile faded. "Then they will take what they need." The villagers moved closer, their steps slow but relentless. The air grew colder, and the sound of the bell's chime seemed to seep into my bones. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "I didn't mean to." "You cannot stop it," the woman said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You can only decide how it ends." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. I turned toward the bell, its golden light pulsing with each chime. If this was the heart of the hollow, maybe I could stop it. Maybe destroying the bell would end all of this. I grabbed a broken candlestick from the altar and raised it high, preparing to strike. "No!" the woman screamed, her hollow eyes wide with fear. Before I could bring the candlestick down, the villagers surged forward, their hands grasping at me. Their strength was overwhelming, their icy fingers digging into my skin as they dragged me back. The woman stepped closer, her face twisted with anger. "You cannot destroy the bell," she said. "It is the only thing holding this place together. Without it, there will be nothing." "Maybe nothing is better than this," I said, through gritted teeth. Her expression softened just for a moment. "You don't understand," she said. "If you destroy the bell, you destroy yourself." The words stopped me cold. "What are you talking about?" She gestured toward the bell. "It is tied to you now. You rang it. Its power flows through you. If you break it, you will break with it." The villagers tightened their grip, their hollow eyes staring into mine. The bell's chime grew louder, its golden light brighter, until it was almost blinding. I felt the weight of their words, the weight of the bell's demands. If I destroyed it, I would end the curse, but at the cost of my own life. But if I didn't, the hollow would continue its cycle of sacrifices, its endless demand for balance. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking. There has to be another way. "There isn't," the woman said, her voice laced with sorrow. "There never was." I closed my eyes, the sound of the bell filling my ears. The villager's grip on me loosened, and I felt the weight of the candlestick in my hand. When I opened my eyes, I saw the woman watching me, her hollow gaze steady. "Do what you must," she said. I raised the candlestick high, the golden light of the bell reflecting off its tarnished surface. "For balance," I whispered, and then I brought it down. The sound was deafening, a shattering roar that seemed to split the very air. The golden light of the bell exploded outward, consuming everything in its path. The villagers screamed, their voices blending with the chime of the bell as their forms dissolved into ash. The woman fell to her knees, her hollow eyes filling with something that looked like relief. And then there was silence. I woke in the snow, the cold seeping into my bones. The village was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of forest. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty and silent. The bell was gone, its golden light extinguished, but I could still feel it, a faint hum deep within me, a reminder of what I had done. I got to my feet, my legs trembling, and began to walk. Ashen Hollow was gone, but the bells would always remain.